Thank you for joining. My name is Eric Clay. I'm the Director of Marketing at Flare, and with me is Mathieu Lavoie. He is the Chief Technology Officer. Mathieu, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Eric. So everyone, thanks to be there. I will be quick. So I'm one of the co-founder of Flare. We started Flare 5 years ago. I'm Chief Technical Officer, and I'm here today with Eric. I work on that research in collaboration with Eric. So I'll be happy to be here today and present some of the work that the research team, Eric, and I have done.
Awesome. So today we're talking about dissecting the dark web supply chain and infected devices. So let's go ahead and kick this off. So what is stealer malware? What is an infected device? So the general way things work is a computer gets infected with stealer malware, and that can happen from a variety of things. I would say cracked software, phishing emails, and malicious advertisements are probably the top three. Were there any that you would add or really highlight there, Mathieu?
No, I think it's really kind of we see a lot as well a lot of malversing advertising campaign that lead to infection. So to that research, the source of infection from sort of the research we did here to especially Redline and Raccoon was coming from malicious ads that were pushed by different website, and that's what we've seen in terms of infection change mainly. For sure, there's different we don't have the potential to say that we studied all the different possibilities afterward, but I think that give a good example of what is possible and what is common with those type of infections.
Yeah, so commonly Google and Facebook ads, I think, are the top two, although I'm sure that there's malicious ads on other networks as well.
YouTube as well, yeah.
Okay, so stealer malware then infects a computer and it exfiltrates the browser fingerprint. It'll exfiltrate saved passwords in the browser, active session cookies, the operating system data, and then all of these things get resold on these specialized dark web markets. So you have Russian market, which is a kind of traditional dark web market. You have Genesis market, which is actually a clear web marketplace. And then you have, I think, about a dozen or so illicit Telegram channels, maybe a few more, that are commonly either giving away stealer logs or selling them. From there, a threat actor can take a stealer log, purchase it from one of these specialized marketplaces, especially if it has, I'm going to jump back here actually for just a moment. So in a marketplace listing, typically you'll have the domains and subdomains listed for sale. So you can say like, oh, I want to buy a browser fingerprint that has a VPN login, or in some cases a corporate login. And that can really help a threat actor to launch targeted attacks or get what they're interested in. Do you want a Netflix login or an HBO login, or do you want the login to a healthcare organization, a hospital, a bank, etc.? Commonly we see a lot of threat actors just buying things to get access to VPNs and really basic stuff. But there's certainly a subset that are buying stealer logs that specifically have access to corporate networks in order to gain access and then launch additional attacks. And that could be distributing ransomware, it could be stealing and selling data, or they could be accessing the corporate environment just to establish that access is there, to expand that access, and then to auction it off on specific dark web forums as initial access brokers. So here's the traditional life cycle of a stealer malware attack. You have a malware as a service vendor. They sell stealer malware and associated command and control infrastructure. We commonly see this on specialized Telegram channels. The threat actors then purchase malware, set up or purchase distribution infrastructure. Stealer malware is distributed through those malicious advertisements that Mathieu was kind enough to talk about, through phishing emails, etc. Once it's distributed, it infects a computer. It steals the browser fingerprint. It steals saved passwords. It steals cryptocurrency logins. It pulls basic data about the host, like the operating system, etc., and then exfiltrates that back to command and control infrastructure. Threat actors and groups then sell those infected devices on specialized dark web markets, which we'll be covering in more detail in a minute, and along with illicit Telegram channels. Other threat actors will purchase those logs. Sometimes they'll just purchase them themselves to get access to a VPN or an HBO login. And usually those are going to sell for a few dollars. But in other cases, you'll see threat actors specifically searching for logs that have access to these really sensitive corporate environments in order to either launch an attack themselves or then auction them off for thousands of dollars on other dark web forums. And finally, a new threat actor might purchase one of these logs and use it to actually launch an attack or purchase access through an initial access broker. So what does stealer malware capture? We get the operating system version, the ISP, active session cookies, which can be used to bypass two-factor authentication and multi-factor authentication, IP addresses, FTP client information, VPN credentials, the browser cache found in some variants, geographic location of the device, browser fingerprints to be used for session hijacking and account compromise, cryptocurrency wallets, browser history, and saved credit cards. I would say, Matthew, are there any that are missing here, any that you feel are worth mentioning? Like, I think one that I found really surprising is you have some newer variants that will even steal things like the data copied in a clipboard, which is getting very granular.
Yeah, I think it's getting really granular, but you have to keep in mind that we find as well into those communication the communication scheme between the CNC and the machine, and as well any methods to update or execute code on the victim. So it's yes, what we see is most of the information is being stolen and then sent back to the CNC, but we see as well some capacity in those malware to run some code and to execute some malware directly on the infected machine of the client. So more than stealing the information, that's the reason why if you have a corporate machine, you have to assume that you could have been victim of remote code execution within your environment and start an incident response at that moment.
So to recap, you're saying that not only, so we're stealing all of this data, first of all, which can facilitate additional access, but there's also the chance that they could use the payload that's already on the infected device to send additional malicious code. So it kind of goes both ways, and it presents an ongoing risk.
Yes.
Yeah, that's absolutely a critical thing worth mentioning. And what kinds of attacks could somebody use? So they have the foothold in the network, or the foothold on a host, an infected device. What other types of attacks could they execute for malicious code, Matthew? With malicious code.
With malicious code, well, I mean, it's kind of the concept of the patient zero and incident response. So basically, getting access to initial machine within the inside of the environment, and from there, trying to pivot and try to increase the privilege on the machine, and then pivot to other machine in order to get access in the machine. And this is what we usually see when we say sometimes the stealer log is being acquired by a malicious actor in order to transform that to an initial access, and this is why we call them initial access brokers. So we see some malicious actor that buy at bulk private logs. So instead of like passing to those network, they will go straight to the stealer logs operator and say, I'm willing to buy you a set of logs or a big machine that you're not going to sell into those platforms. You're going to sell it directly to me. They curate some of them, auction some of the most valuable out of this dump, and as well, we see as well another specialized actor that came into the chain that will buy an access that's been curated from a corporate network, will use that information to get access to the machine or establish a footprint within the organization and then sell this access into the corporate network with either, we've seen some that start like, I have an admin access on the station, I have an admin access on the sysadmin workstation, and we've also seen that I have a domain controller access, so basically a full commission of the network, of the Windows network, the Microsoft network, the Active Directory of an organization. So we've seen different access being resold as well. That could come from a malware stealer malware such as Raccoon or Red Light.
Yeah, it's interesting because the prices vary so much. So for an average stealer log, you're looking at like $20 or $30 to buy one, right? But then when you get into ones that have like special internal access to healthcare environments or to financial services or to these like specific corporate networks, maybe a stealer log goes for $100, $150. But then there's kind of another jump there where you have the initial access brokers who are buying these stealer logs at $100, $150, and then taking them, expanding that access, validating that access, and then they'll be selling that access for thousands of dollars. So there's this huge price jump once the access has been validated, which I think brings us pretty smoothly to our next topic, which is the platforms that these are sold on. So there's really, I mean, some stealer logs, like some threat actors, it's pretty easy to see them buying access to malware as a service, so Redline, Raccoon, et cetera, and then just using it for targeted attacks. You know, somebody says, I want to target this specific organization, I'm going to buy access to the malware, and I'm going to target this specific organization with it, with spear phishing campaigns or watering hole attacks or these types of things. But I would say that's probably not the norm. The norm is threat actors buying access to malware as a service and then distributing it and then reselling access to these individual devices on Genesis Market, Russian Market, and illicit Telegram channels. Like I would say those are the three big sources. From there, so let's talk about Genesis Market for a minute. So the listings on Genesis Market provide the following information before purchase: the country where the bot is located, the number of resources attached to the bot, the number of browser fingerprints, the date of the bot installation and last update, a partial IP address, the operating system of the bot, and the list of resources that are available. In case we're talking about resources or specific domains that the bot has saved credentials for. Matthew, what makes Genesis Market unique? And you know, it's also interesting. It's a clear web market. Why do you think it's able to stay up? And you know, what are the advantages of being a clear web market in comparison to a dark web market? So I asked you like 3 questions there. So I'll let you get.
Yeah, I'll try to. So I think this the tool set that come with the Genesis Market, they develop as well some plugins that you can actually use right away. So the ease of use, let's say, is definitely something that make them competitive on this stealer malware scene. As seen as well that from Genesis, from the study we did, it looked like it's a bit more targeted attack, or more like, well, I should say targeted country. So basically we see more more stealer logs on sale on that platform that is coming from richer country, more like as well a country from the NATO, and we see it as well more corporate machine being sold on that website. I think that is what make them unique. How they are operating, I mean, it's not unique that they are operating from the clear web. You were mentioning Russian market. They also have a clear web mirror, and they tend to have both, like a dark web mirror and a clear web mirror. And in that case, even though it's accessible to the clear web, most of the infrastructure will be hosted on what we call the bulletproof hosting. So basically, DNS registrar that are not necessarily responding to abuse, as well as hosting infrastructure that is located in some country that are more prone to resist to the mandate or the takedown from the takedown requests that could come in.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I think one of the things too that has always struck me about Genesis Market is like you'll see on the GIF we have here on the right. It's very, very easy when you purchase a listing to also mimic a browser fingerprint. And I believe they even have something like 24/7 support available for people who have questions, along with an expansive wiki. And I think this really goes back to another trend that our research team has identified, which is the commodification of cybercrime. Things are getting very, very commodified, and it's almost like interacting with a real world company, which is very interesting compared to like these really traditional dark web markets where you're paying X amount and you're getting stolen credentials, and there's not a lot of additional customer support provided. Now, the second one that Matthew briefly touched on here to talk about is Russian market. So each listing on Russian market typically contains the stealer malware family. There's about a dozen or more different families: Redline, Raccoon, Vidar. There's a lot of smaller ones. Redline is the most prominent one. It'll have the computer's operating system, the computer's location by country, the list of web services / websites for which a login is available, directory content of the archive made by the stealer software, and the date the device was infected. One interesting thing to note here is devices. There's definitely devices that were infected earlier are worth less, right? The longer an infected device has been for sale, the value drops precipitously as the logins get changed, the infection could be removed, etc. Matthew, is there anything particularly so interesting to note about Russian market that you don't think we've hit on?
No, I think you covered most of it. I think the only mention here is like those information are not necessarily verified, so they are being extracted directly in that case, either from the Chrome profile or the Firefox profile directly, and basically it's the safe password. There's no validation that is being made to see if the credential actually worked. So that's why it's kind of a concept where we're still into the concept of non-targeted attack here. So even though everyone is kind of being put on sales almost at the same price, there's not so much price discrepancy as compared to, for example, Genesis, where we see a lot of like variation in the price depending on the value of the information that is that is being stolen from the machine. Here we see like a lot of volume, but not so more of a scoring of what could be the most interesting. So they have probably less validation, and we see more like an approach that is more non-targeted than targeted here.
And finally, the last one that's worth talking about is illicit Telegram channels. So I think there are dozens of these at a minimum, Mathieu, potentially even more. And the way that we've seen most illicit Telegram channels work is pretty different than Genesis or Russian market, where people are typically buying access to a channel which will have hundreds of thousands of logs, but there's typically a guaranteed minimum. So there's a certain minimum number of logs that will be distributed through the channel per month. And you can even buy special seats that are $100 or $200, where you're guaranteed to be one of 3 or 4 people who have access to the really like the very freshest, most initial logs before they're passed to everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the other thing I want to mention is, the saying that if it's free, it's because you're the product. And what we see in those free Telegram markets is there's a lot of like malware infected archives that are being shared freely. And to come back to what could be the infected source of those stealer malware, we can probably add on top of it that the stealer logs being distributed for free is probably as well one of the channels to acquire an additional victim as well. So be cautious if you for research purposes, if you study those, make sure that you're cautious with that, because most of these samples that we find have some kind of malware in it, and basically you need to be cautious when working with that.
So we touched on this a little bit earlier, Mathieu, but where do high value logs go? So you have some people may buy malware as a service or Redline, et cetera, to launch a targeted attack. You have a lot of threat actors who are just launching attacks and then selling access on Russian market, Genesis market, and all of these illicit Telegram channels. But there's this kind of other section where we have initial access brokers. Can you spend a minute just talking about what an initial access broker is and how they're different than kind of these groups that are just distributing stealer malware on a large scale?
Mm-hmm. By definition, an initial access broker will provide a working initial access. So basically an access to an infected machine that we can use and leverage, as opposed to a sealer log that is mostly kind of an output of the information that is on that machine. So you see a little bit of the difference here. You need to make an additional step to, first of all, use the stolen information in order to convert that to an access that is persistent on the machine. So usually when an initial access broker will sell you a persistence that you can use on a machine, a server, a domain controller, and that goes as well by sync with the price, as well as what we see is on the Genesis market, the Russian market, and the Telegram. We can mainly assume that access are being reshared and being sold to multiple people, as opposed to someone, as I mentioned before. So let's say you have a malicious actor that goes straight to the command and control operator and say, I want to buy 100,000 of your logs, but you don't resell it to no one else. Basically, what they will do is they will buy a bunch of logs. They will validate them. They will use as well some like tools that like legitimate
third-party information.
Yeah, to kind of to identify what are the different company, what could be the different company being targeted. They will use the stolen information, validate the access, try to get in the company, and for those who actually are able to get in and get an access with those stolen information, they will auction that access, and the price goes up because it's distributed. Like you only have one buyer. So that's the difference. So it's more expensive because when you buy that access, most likely it won't be resold to another malicious actor. So that's why I think the price is different, and it's way more like tailored in terms of offer.
So it's kind of like the difference between valet parking or paying and going and finding a parking garage and paying yourself. They're doing all the work for you and taking out the hard part and just handing you over access to a network or corporate infrastructure.
I would push the metaphor even more and say that it's a private driver. Like the driver only drives like a valet parking. They will drive multiple car and like it's only for you. So basically, it's a valet parking. It's a one-time use valet parking. So a private driver.
Okay, I like I think your expanded metaphor is even better.
Yeah, I know we are diverting a little bit, but yeah.
So let's give some specific examples of these kind of high value logs, right? Because from what I've seen, like probably 90%, maybe even more of Stealer logs are really basic consumer stuff. It's people who maybe don't have any corporate access or they don't have particularly important corporate access, and the logs are really being bought for VPNs, for Netflix logins. Well, maybe not Netflix anymore, but HBO logins, etc. So, but there's like this small subset that is really, really valuable and that these initial access brokers can buy, or that they can buy in bulk and then identify these specific logs. So what are the things that makes a log really valuable? And we have a few examples here. Password managers tend to be more valuable than, logs with password managers tend to be more valuable than those without. VPNs, website logins, etc. Are there any others that you can think of, Matthew, that would really indicate that a log is much, much more valuable, and kind of on the flip side that you would want to monitor for as a company, right? If this subdomain got out, this is really, really important for us.
I'd say, so basically there's I'll split that in kind of 3 categories. The untargeted that have no interesting information. So like, I mean, a social media credential on the personal machine that we don't necessarily care. First category. Second one is more like personal computer, non-targeted attack, but contains some banking credential, cryptocurrency credential. So basically there's a potential gain. There's a potential financial gain, even though we're not targeting a different, like a corporation or an institution. We're still using the information from on the personal machine in order to convert it to fraud directly. And basically the third category, I'd say it's, yes, there's the one that are non-targeted, that targets a specific corporation, so corporate name, VPN, etc. So credential that could be used by someone to get into the company and either use that initial access or resold that initial access, and in that case becoming an initial access broker. So use that credential, converted it, and then act as an initial access broker and they resold that access here. So the one that you see on the bottom of the screen, it seems like this. So use a machine, use the information on that machine, get them to the first entry points. So on either connected to the corporate network or either having access to a corporate machine, and then pivot, increase privilege on that infrastructure, pivots to a different machine, and then ends up on a medical server, and then resold that access to the medical server through an auction right directly onto illicit communities. And what you see here is basically it starts at 5,000. So every step for the bet is 1,000. And Blitz is kind of the concept of buy now on eBay if you want to make a parallel. So basically you can buy it out right away for 9,000 if you want.
No, it's fascinating how complex the supply chain is, and in some cases where you have, and we have another example here. So we're covering a lot of information we've already covered, but they buy, an initial access broker buys a Stealer log, they validate access, they potentially move laterally through networks and services to establish additional access to increase the value of that initial access, and then they even take third-party data from even some of these sales data providers who are selling data to companies to facilitate a sales process, and then they use that to even enrich the offering further. So we have another one. Go ahead.
Yeah, this one, for example, it's less valuable than the other one. The reason why is because you see it's a local administration right. So basically, you have the local admin right on the workstation and don't have necessarily have access to the server yet.
Yeah, so you would have the threat actor who was purchasing this would have to expand that access further.
Or stay on the machine and see if you can leverage that local admin to get some financial gain, but I doubt it.
So going back to Stealer malware. So besides initial access brokers, right? One of the studies we ran that was really, really interesting lately is we looked at infected devices for sale on Genesis Market specifically. And we looked at the average price of an infected device, and it came out to $14.39 US. And then we looked at the average price of an infected device that had access to one of 100 corporate healthcare logins. And the price ended up being $93.91. We're currently running the same analysis on financial services and looking specifically at Stealer logs that have bank accounts. And from what I saw briefly before we jumped on the webinar, it looks like it's over $100. So I don't know if there's anything specifically actionable to take out of this besides the fact that this really correlates very strongly with the fact that we see public health information and financial information as two of the most valuable types of information that are sold on the dark web. And this really reflects back on the Stealer malware and Stealer logs too. If a log has access to a corporate banking login, to a corporate healthcare login, or even a personal banking or personal healthcare login, those logs are considerably more valuable than those without. Is there anything you'd want to add here, Matthew?
No, I think nothing to add here. I think you summed it well.
So how can people actually, so what, somebody buys a log, or maybe they buy access from initial access broker, either way, it's kind of the same result. What do people do with that access? Can you run through a couple of kind of common scenarios, Matthew, of how they might exploit that access, whether it's selling private health information, distributing ransomware, et cetera?
Specific to the healthcare, I think yes, the information is worth something. It's always like and that's why, for example, if we go back a few slides of what we were saying of like a personal machine with banking account and like cryptocurrency account active on the machine worth probably more because you have a direct access to money. In terms of medical information, I think ransomware is probably a potential avenue that cybercriminal will look into because there is sensitive data, there is important data. It's the critical. It's unfortunate. Unfortunately, we've seen some occurrence of ransomware group that were targeting healthcare services. Because it puts a lot of pressure. It's an essential services. We've seen some group that decided not to target those because they don't want to create any direct impact on the potential life. But for healthcare, I'd say ransomware is still a valid scenario there. I think PII, the medical PII, is still valuable if you wanted to go, especially in the US, into insurance claim and fake and fraudulent insurance claim. So those are kind of the two examples that, on top of my head, I could think that could be targeting the medical sector. Generally speaking, I think it's for corporation. I think ransomware is absolutely a risk. I think stealing information, stealing secret. We've seen some ransomware group that don't even encrypt the file anymore. They just kind of extract them. And
is it still ransomware if they don't encrypt it, Matthew?
It is, because they're still asked for ransom. So by definition, it is. But what we've seen as well, we've seen some group that just basically auction it right away, and they don't necessarily go into different extortion strategy or tactic that we've seen in the past.
So there's no encryption. They maybe they take an infected device, they leverage it for the access, or they buy it from an initial access broker. They steal a whole lot of data, all the company's files that they can get access to, and they don't even bother encrypting anything. They just say, we're going to go post this on a dark web leak site, in 5 days if you don't pay us $50, $100, $200,000.
They don't even bother locking the machine or like blocking the machine. So they just kind of reach out and say, we have this data, we stole it from you. They don't impact the operation of the company. They just reach out and say, hey, we have this data, here's some proof. Here's what we're asking for. Some as well just warn the company that there will be an auction for their own data if they want to buy it back, or otherwise it will just being sold to the highest bidder.
So we have a specific question here, Matthew, on this from our audience. What is the specific threat of unencrypted ransomware? Just the threat that they will sell the data on the dark web? And how can the victim even prove it hasn't already been sold?
I think it's haven't been sold or won't or have been destroyed. It's always kind of all the kind of ransomware. What we've seen is like it's tough to get an evidence or proof that the data have been completely destroyed after you pay the ransom, for example. So it come back to the same question of like, how can you trust? So basically, instead of locking the machine and stopping the process, they will reach out by email or to the security teams of, or even like the management team of the organization, and say, hey, we have some data. Here's some proof of that data that you have, that is your data, and this is what we have in file listing, and this is what we're asking to destroy the data and not necessarily publishing it. So the only difference really is just like locking the machine and encrypting the machine, and so basically the threat of like, they basically stop the threat of like, we will unlock that for you. They don't even do that. They only use the extortion method of like, we will make those files public to everyone. So that's
and Matthew,
yeah.
I want to ask a follow up to this. So, from what you've seen, are ransomware groups often selling the files after the fact? So, let's say the company pays the ransom, maybe they even take off the timer with the dark web file leak site. Do you think they're still selling the data? I mean, there's going to be a subset that is, right? How big is that subset? Like, what do you think the most common one is? Are they actually destroying it?
We don't have a lot of, honestly, we don't have a lot of data on this but what we've seen is I haven't seen personally occurrence of like data where a company has paid the ransom that have been published. So I think it comes back to the fact that if they don't respect their own agreement, they like the next victim won't necessarily fall for that and say, in any case, you're going to publish it anyway. So I think in most of the case, data is being destroyed, or at least not published. But it's tough to say with certainty that it's always being destroyed and never will be published. It's not necessarily being traded into a one-to-one or private messaging afterward. That it's honestly, I don't have this information that I can confirm that's never happened. But generally speaking, we haven't seen the data of an organization. I haven't seen the data of an organization that claimed to have paid the ransom.
It's good to know there still might be ethics in cybercrime, at least.
Well, I think it's strategy. If you start to resell it anyway, it's a short view.
It's short-term gain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because nobody will pay.
Exactly.
Especially not the larger companies that have fairly sophisticated security operations, where they know the game and they know how it's working. And if people are just giving away the data for free after the ransom's paid, it kind of loses its value. So the next one here I want to talk about is credential compromise and reselling, right? So somebody could get an infected device, leverage for additional access, and then potentially compromise credentials either in plain text or that are encrypted, and then resell those on the dark web. It can kind of this really traditional stolen credential avenue. Have you seen this, Matthew? Do you have any data on whether threat actors are using infected devices to actually steal kind of traditional credentials from some third-party application and then just sell those on the dark web?
We've seen, so there definitely we've seen some compromise credential being resold and being used. We've seen a lot of credential stuffing. Honestly, it's tough for us in a position to know what is the portion of credential that's coming from an infected machine that is using credential stuffing attack compared to breach that happen and data breach that are being used in credential stuffing. So we don't have specific metric on like 10% of the credential stuffing attacks are made with like infected machine credential stolen. So it's tough for me to say that. We assume that, I mean, if you have the information and if you see clear patterns of password in the safe password of a machine, I mean, it's possible that this information is being reused to credential stuffing. That would be logical for me to use those credential in order to do credential stuff, to use a credential that are saved into the machine to do some credential stuffing. So I'd say it's possible. I'm not able to give you one example. I think the closest example that is in the literature into credential stuffing attack that lead to ransomware is the Colonial Pipeline. So to the incident report, to the incident report, to the response report. So the incident response report, the initial access was to credential stuffing, so basically stolen credential. It wasn't mentioned where this credential was coming, especially if it was a credential that were coming from a data breach or stolen credential on an infected machine. I don't think we had that information in the report, but we know that a credential that was coming from the dark web and from illicit communities was used in order to get a valid VPN account into connecting to the Colonial pipeline network and then deploying the ransomware.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. It's interesting because I think one of the key things I've seen, at least, is a lot of security news sites or will just report like, oh, that it was compromised via stolen credentials without ever specifying where the stolen credentials came from. Because you could have an employee have a third-party application that your organization uses, have a data breach, and there's a lot of credentials, and the employees just reuse passwords across their VPN. And then this third-party application, threat actors can run a credential stuffing attack using the credentials that were compromised by the third party and just try them on different corporate applications. But infected devices are almost more personalized in a way, because you might have a threat actor who has a lot of different corporate logins all saved within one, and they have the exact password, at least at the time the machine was infected, for that.
Yeah, exactly. So there's one bet left, that betting that the user will reuse the same password on different components. You basically, you know that this safe password was used for this specific portal.
All right, Matthew, it's time to get to concrete recommendations. So the first one we have is monitor infected device markets. And you need to be able to monitor Russian market, Genesis market, and then multiple illicit Telegram channels that are giving these logs out for free. Matthew, can you talk a little bit about the difficulty of monitoring infected device markets and what the best practices are for doing it?
I think absolutely the volume and the lifetime. So you need to read at the right place at the right time. The flow is constant, and you need to be able to ingest that flow. So you cannot go like 3 months later, and then you most likely won't have access to like archive that are older than a few days, for example. So you need to do it in a continuous manner, which make it a little bit difficult. And as well, the volume is still fairly significant. And the other difficulty is like, there's no standard format. So, I mean, it could be into all kind of formats. It's not normalized. It's not like one type of archive that's being used. It's basically text file, zip archive that contain multiple folders. Each folder contain one or multiple zip file, like representing one or multiple computers. So it's really kind of the difficulty to be able to parse the data and normalize it. I think, as well, as I mentioned, is being cautious with that work, because I mean, free stolen logs are probably a source of infection for those same malicious actor. So we've seen a lot of like being cautious with the file, make sure you don't get yourself compromised while trying to assess the potential data there. So I'd say that's probably the biggest challenge, to do it manually without any automation. It's definitely challenging.
And what would you say the best, like if I was let's say a large enterprise organization, I was looking to implement infected device monitoring, what would be the main ways you would do that? Let's say they're using a platform like Flare, where you can automate infected device monitoring across a lot of different channels simultaneously. What would be the main subdomains you would want to monitor as a corporation, right? Because if you do, especially if you're like a financial institution or something like that, you may have a lot of customer logins as well. So are there specific subdomains that are kind of really high value to monitor for?
Yeah, I think absolutely the subdomains that are being used for remote access by employees is that absolutely something I would be looking for. You can try to do and take the opposite approach, where you look for the top domain and in your ring some of the subdomains that represent the customer portal. I mean, it's probably an approach where you'll keep adding new exception and probably not viable. So, but that's the two options I'm seeing. So either identifying what are the public-facing domain that could be used by employee, third party, business partner, reseller, in order to access the business data and try to monitor for those, or take the opposite approach where you monitor all the top domains, and then in your ring the match that are customer subdomains, or the domains that that you'll probably have a lot of clients that have their access been compromised. That being said, if you have the bandwidth to be able to identify which customer have been compromised and forced to change password, I think it could absolutely be a good use case. But if your first use case is to protect the organization itself, it could be definitely a little bit noisy.
And the second recommendation we have here is set up automated processes to detect staged attack infrastructure. So this would be things like lookalike domains, et cetera. Are there any recommendations you can give people on kind of, if not anticipating attacks, at least detecting it when attack infrastructure is being set up that may be used for a spear phishing campaign or something like that, targeted specifically at your organization?
Yeah, I think if you can, like, as we consider one of the main infection vector to being a phishing, I think that makes sense in that regard. I think looking at the newly bought domain, as well as certificates that are being bought out, so certificate transparency, and looking into like certificates, you'll be able to identify some domain that match you, and sometimes the certificate itself contains multiple domains, so it enables you to pivot on that. I'd say as well, looking into site that have the same 5-icon hash is absolutely a technique that works and it's efficient. So it's all kind of like tactic you can put in place. I don't think it's only valuable for Stealer logs. I think it could for Stealer malware. I think it could be relevant for all kind of phishing and targeted phishing attack. But yeah, I think looking at the flow, matching a domain, doing some fuzziness, looking into certificate transparency, as well as trying to find some graphic evidence of lookalike domain through 5-icons or just the color scheme of the page.
Absolutely. And then the last one we have here is identifying infected devices affecting third parties. And this is another one where, it would depend on the organization's bandwidth. A lot of organizations probably they have so many alerts and it's difficult to even keep up with, assuming they have the right ability to monitor for it. It might be even difficult to keep up with infected devices affecting them, much less third parties. But this is actually an interesting use case that has come up with several customer conversations and prospect conversations recently, as they say, it's great. We have this down for us, but what we're trying to do now is actually expand this technical like risk indicator monitoring to our third parties to identify if they have infected devices associated with their really, really poor logins, like password managers, et cetera. So I don't have any specific questions around this. I just thought it was an interesting trend that is probably worth flagging.
Absolutely.
Well, that is it for our presentation. I think we're going to take a few audience questions. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Blair can automate monitoring for infected devices across Russian market, Genesis market, and dozens of illicit Telegram channels. We set up in 15 minutes, and we're easily used by entry-level analysts. And our pricing model supports unlimited seats, so you can bring your entry-level analyst in and not have to pay $10,000 a seat. So I think we have one question already, and please put your questions in either the chat or the Q&A. What is the average length of an infection? And I think you got at this a little bit earlier, Mathieu, when you mentioned that a lot of infections are not super valuable after a couple months, either from a monitoring standpoint or even to the threat actors who are buying and selling them.
Yeah, I don't have specific number for like Stealer malware infection timeline, but generally speaking, the statistic that we've seen like last year, I think was generally speaking, it take like 180 days to approximately 6 months for an average for an infection to be detected. So I think that could be, we can assume it could be around that. Unfortunately, I don't have specific number for that specific type of infection and malware. So I would say I will go with the general tendency to say the average of 6 months before detected. The second one on the ransomware. So for the ransomware that don't encrypt file and just, so yes, you can assume that it's lost, but you need to assume as well that it will be reshared, that information to other, like it will be reshared publicly. So basically the threat that they do is like, yes, we haven't blocked your operation, but we have a full set of data and we are willing to make that public to everyone that wants to download it and have access to that information. So it's always kind of a considering like what's that I've installed and how can that data be used by malicious intent person in order to commit additional crime, cybercrime or fraud. So the risk is, like, yes, you can assume that it's lost and continue business as usual, but you need also to assume that this data is not part of the public domain and could be reused in any way possible. Third question. Yeah, so I'm reading question out loud, Eric. So
yeah, that's okay, Mathieu. Go for it.
How can I identify if one of my corporate devices is infected? first of all, I think like having a good EDR, having an AV is absolutely part of the basic. I think most of the company will have signature for the different version of the red line, the raccoon, the VDAR, and name like the basically the Stilo logs. So I think that is like having a good EDR in place, having a good detection system in place on the workstation is something. One of the concerns we had as a company is like how can we monitor the personal machine of an employee that could have some corporate credential on it, and this is a little bit tricky. And that's why I think one of the best way to do that is to go, unfortunately, a little bit more on the early detection with something with the solution like Flare, or like basically looking at what is being shared and identify the machine. When you identify a machine, let's say on the Russian market, what you'll have is you'll know that you have one machine that have those site cookie or safe password. So really, it's go back to the web proxy and say, in all the machine that I have, who have visited this website in the last 30 days? Okay, I can exclude 50% of my machine. Okay, next one. Who also are part of this 50 that have visited the first website? Which all have visited the second website in the last 2 days? Okay, this percentage. And then you go pinpointing to only a few machines. So that's a way you can do that without having to buy the information. We don't recommend you buying the information from those markets. And we've seen some success story where it's been possible only with the information that is disclosed there to identify what other potential machine that could correspond to that specific profile that is being advertised on those markets. So I think that is something you should do. For the personal machine, it's a little bit more tricky because you don't necessarily have an access on it. I think if a personal machine, two-factor authentication is absolutely something you should put in place. You should have you should be looking for infected machine because there are definitely a threat and a risk, and those are username, password that have been like disclosed publicly. And if that's a corporate username password, that could also be reused for password spraying. So it's good that you're aware of that. But if you want as well to add an actual layer of security, I think like having a MFA, multi-factor authentication, is absolutely a must in our today's ecosystem. I think we can probably talk about it in another webinar, but MFA mechanisms are being targeted by cybercriminals. So as we see more and more MFA being deployed, we see the tactical cybercriminal adapting to that. But that being said, it does complicate it a lot, the work of a cybercriminal, if you have a good MFA system in place for your corporation.
Excellent. Thank you, Mathieu. Well, I think that is all the questions we have today. So I'll thank everybody for attending today. Oh, we actually got one more. Do we see infected device markets moving entirely to Telegram?
We see more and more automation toward Telegram. So we start to see even more like, I think, infrastructure that are actually using Telegram as part of like gathering the information, stealing the information. So we see more and more like codes that use the Telegram API and like automation and integrations with Telegram. So I'd say, I think it's fair to say that it will increase, and it's absolutely one place you should look. I don't think the website where you can buy at bulk and then you can like select like which domain you're interested in, which country. The Telegram flow is usually more like a bunch of archive and like data dumps are being shared as attachments. So it's not as organized and customizable as the website could offer. So it's more, I think it's you need to do both. I don't think it's one or the other. I think you need to do both, and I think it serves two different needs for cybercriminals, unfortunately.
Well, thank you all for the excellent questions today and the engagement. I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar. If you're interested in learning more about Flare, you can visit flare.systems, or you can just Google Flare cybersecurity. Thank you so much today, Mathieu. I really appreciate having you on.
Happy to be there. Thank you.